can do a lot with a budget. You know, we're coming from LA, and there's what's known as like the People's Budget, which is an entire movement that works along with Black Lives Matter LA. And they've been successful, although it is to be determined how much the money has been steered away from the LAPD and into what services. But you can do a lot with a budget, and it is not the sexiest work, but like, you know, how goes.
I mean, first of all, they're doing like really dope shit in LA. Like one of the targeted things they did was they took money from police in schools, and they made, for the first time in history, basically in the LA school system, targeted investments specifically, you know, in Black students. And so instead of having police officers, they had these teams, right? Like a director of culture. They had restorative justice, you know, folks. They had counselors and social workers, and they saw incredible results in a short period of time. And on a budget front, we're seeing these kinds of successes in a lot of different places. You go to Austin, they defunded the police and turned hotels into housing and got good results. Even in like, and you have to layer all of these different things, right? Like you look at Philly, they gave housing grants to small homeowners that needed repairs, and within 3 months they saw crime go down, right? Like an understanding that public safety, the source of it is so many different things, right? And like completely separating police incarceration from our definition of public safety is a key piece of it. Yes.
I'm curious as to the dynamic of when you get to the city council and you have that dynamic where now people are, you know, you're a fellow city council person and they're treating you differently, and maybe they need your vote down the road or whatever their motivation are. And you start to articulate to them these ideas, which for a long time I feel like have been shut out of those positions of power. Like, what is their response? Like, do you have people who just go like, what? And I never thought about, I mean, do you, are there moments where you just like feel like, oh, I just blew that dude's mind completely? And
these are my favorite conversations, especially with people who do not agree with me or think that they don't agree with me.
Right, they think you're a lunatic, and you start.
Wait, hold on. Can we like dig into that a little bit? Because
yes.
I swear to fucking God, the thing that has been most shocking to me throughout this process is that I had no idea how many people thought that I was like a monster boogeyman, and I will go and talk to them. And then I keep hearing from all these other different people who come up to me and are like, you know, everybody is telling me that, like, you're really nice and really reasonable and thoughtful and smart, and they were so surprised by it. And I'm like, yeah, like I am not, I don't know. And then I'm like, well,
she had showered and everything. And I was just so impressed.
I liked her blazer.
But I mean, do you get that sense like you're talking to people, and can you, I mean, I imagine there are some people who are like, oh, no, you know, everything for me is about what I can do for my real estate buddies. But I imagine there's also some people who are like, oh, I hadn't really contemplated that. And can you, like, actually see that change? I'm just curious about that dynamic of what the difference is to have one person or multiple people on a body like that and what impact it can have.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be lying if I was like, oh, I had a conversation with a colleague and now they're an abolitionist.
They're an abolitionist.
They're an abolitionist. All 51 members, abolitionists. But I will say that being able to take the time and have these conversations, I feel pretty encouraged, right? Like, you're not going to get somebody every single, like, the whole way, right? It is all part of a process. But I had one conversation a while back with a council member who has seemingly very opposing views on policing, for example, than me, and we started talking about it, and I was like, listen, we want the same thing. We want the safest, healthiest communities possible, and to be honest with you, I only care about outcomes. So let's talk about the same thing that we think an issue is. Right. You want to throw more of the same at it, but why don't, hear me out. Let me present to you these other options that actually are empirically proven to work better. Right? And this person went into, I don't know, a week later, they texted me afterwards. We're talking about somebody that like sent out we can't defund the police. We need to fund the police type literature in their
president.
campaign. And they went to a forum in their area, and they got asked about policing and criminal legal reform, and texted me afterwards and was like, I said one of the things that you told me in our conversation. They didn't really like it, but I believed what you said. It made sense, so I said it. I'm like, that's a win. I'll take it. I will take it.
I took your talking point, hell yeah, and it worked. Like, it's there to take. Like, following up on that, it does feel like we're in a backlash moment to the Black Lives Matter movement, and that sadly on a federal level, no politician truly, at least not those leading Democrats, are interested in taking up a very real, probably the biggest uprising of our lifetimes, and an issue that we all know is, however, 30 years overdue, in need of reform, real reform and change. And you have the president at the State of the Union saying, you gotta fund the police, more training, as if there's any senator saying defund the police at all, as if that's even seriously being talked about. Meanwhile, they can't pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. This is minimum, some no-knock warrant entries it stops, chokeholds it stops, but that's very little. It's something, but they can't even do that. We're in a backlash moment. How do you push back, and especially push through these Democrats?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, one, I just want to share a frustration is that, like, we are constantly waging this battle of the narratives, and we are faced with kind of trying to push back on a lot of the right-wing fear-mongering, and then the corporate Dems just like pile it on. I feel like there's almost no, especially when it comes to policing, criminal legal reform, it's like the third rail, and there are leftists, and then like everybody else is over here. And I think the biggest frustration I have, and I was talking about this earlier, is that we, as elected officials, in places of power and privilege, in places of access to information, like, we know we have access to know, like, what works and what doesn't, and it is the fear of public backlash where, like, electeds have zero backbone, right? We see it here in New York. We have electeds that have said, well, they spent the entire time saying the data shows bail reform is a good thing, and then all of a sudden they're saying, well, I'm not quite sure about that anymore. And like, what changed? Not the data, not the evidence, not the research, like none of that changed, but the like sort of political climate around it has changed. The fervor around it in a given moment has changed, and that's really, really frustrating. But I want to reframe a little bit, because I think the fact that you had President Biden yelling about funding the police is actually kind of, it's kind of indicative of wins in a lot of ways. They're giving this attention, right? It's the same example I give about Minneapolis. People are like, well, defund movement, it failed because this. I'm like, do you know it blows my mind that in this amount of time that was even on the ballot, right? That it got on the ballot to like abolish the police department as it existed and built out a new community safety structure. And then it got a ton of support. It did. Yeah. A ton. And it didn't pass, right? But when you look at the people who didn't end up voting for it, it wasn't all people who were opposed. Actually, there was a subset of people that were like, I want to do this, but you haven't put forth the alternative for me. You haven't, with enough specificity, told me what the alternative is going to look like. And so for me, right, these are all opportunities to keep pushing it forward.
I like that. I like that reframing.
You mentioned that element of the political narrative scares off some people, even though the data, they've accepted the data. And I, rightly or wrongly, am of the belief that the dynamics that exist on a city are not terribly different than they exist on a state, or not terribly different than they exist in a federal level. The stakes may change, but the dynamics of politics is very similar. I'm curious as to like what that feels like when you talk about the political narrative and the hysteria, or whatever it is, the term that you used around that, like what formulates that? Because, I look at like the Biden administration, or you can, depending on the politician, they're in some type of bubble. And I'm curious as to like what makes that bubble where politicians who may not be looking at the polling of what actual voters want or where they can move to, but there are signifiers that create the political narrative around them. What are the elements of that?
I mean, I think there are a lot of things at play. And the thing also that I love about hyperlocal government, about hyperlocal electoral politics, is that we're running, at least, right, progressives, leftists, grassroots candidates, we're running ground games, right? You can't run really ground. The closest we've come to like running a national ground game is Bernie Sanders, right? But we are running on, yeah, you can clap for Bernie.
Clap for Bernie.
Yeah, clap for Bernie. Theo Bernie. Ow!
But like,
Every day I wake up and say, why?
Yeah.
Why is
can
he not
I
president?
tell you that my dog has a Bark for Bernie collar, and I have not had the heart to take it off of her. She's been wearing it for
No.
how long now?
I'm never taking my Bernie sign down. It's just going to be sun-baked and sad there in the lawn, and you're going to have to stare at our failure. Okay, sorry.
But like on a national level, right, when you're up against folks with insanely huge campaign coffers, they're running air games. It's TV, it's mail, but for these hyperlocal offices, you can run circles around other candidates running really good, strong ground games. But the thing that sets it apart, and I also think the thing that creates more on-ramps and like builds our movement is that like we're having face-to-face conversations. We're also getting more information, right? And so I very unapologetically ran on defund, right, on public safety and environmental issues and other things that were like deeply, deeply important in my district. But we had conversations about like what keeps people safe, what makes them feel safe, and I can tell you consistently, not very many people said police first. It was maybe like the sixth or seventh thing they said, if they even said it. If I didn't talk about, lead with police or crime or whatever it is, and just said, hey, what makes you feel safe? What do you need? When I walked into my public, housing complex in my district, what makes you feel safe? I want the trash picked up. I want good jobs. I want, better education.
You have a piece of legislation, actually, I just read about, in terms of domestic violence victims and policing. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, we just did a 6-hour hearing because right now, in order for survivors or victims of domestic violence to access like emergency monetary support, you have to show a cooperation with the police. You have to have filed a police report, and it's a huge barrier because we know most people don't report to the police for obvious reasons, right? So it is actually a fact that domestic violence, intimate partner violence, is between 2 to 4 times more prevalent within the law enforcement community than it is outside of the law enforcement community. So there's a very pervasive
That was a very accurate heckle.
Yeah, it was.
I love that people heckle actual facts at our shows.
It's my kind of audience.
You better fucking, I'm gonna fact check your ass right now. Birdie. Can I ask, before we move on, about Le Mayor, the new mayor, Mr. Adams.
Big support.
He's a
Big
vegan,
support in the
you
room.
guys.
Maturity.
Oh, what? Oh,
Maturity.
what? Wait, is he a pescatarian? They don't have feelings. Oh my God, he eats fish.
You
That's
can be
fucking
a
hilarious.
vegan and eat fish and chicken and pork.
Sometimes beef.
As long as you feel vegan on the inside.
So, like, I know you might be limited on what you can say, but if you were to quantify, if you were to put your love for Mayor Eric Adams into a container, like, would it be bigger than like a New York pizza box, or would it be smaller than? Yeah, would it be like a takeout Chinese food container? Like what? How much love?
Matt did not want to hear the answer.
He ran off the stage.
He had to pee straight up. Just like, the fuck?
He's a huge Adams fan and doesn't want to hear anything. That is.
When when you first posed this question in the back, I think you had mentioned like a bread box.
Yes.
A
bread box.
sandwich container.
Sandwich container.
Um,
A ferry, a New York ferry size of love.
you know, I have to believe that there are things that we can like work together on and move forward. So I'm gonna say, you know, a potted plant. Like there's room to grow.
You gotta care for it. There, look at that politician
And that
over
could be-
here. Very good, very good.
Potted plants range in size dramatically. I mean, that's just
I think we need to get more.
We're like, are we
It's
talking
just
about a
the truth.
succulent?
Is that Trader Joe's?
tiny
like,
cactuses and then big like fig trees.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. I feel like it's kind of a $4.99. Picked it up from Trader Joe's, succulent. You know, we'll see. Shit'll probably be dead in 6 months, but. All right, but because we are in a particular moment where there's like a lot of real or imagined sort of stories of violent crime here in New York that are ricocheting, and you have Adams essentially doubling, tripling down on police presence and talking about his police force, talking about enforcing basically rules against sleeping on the subway cars, things like that, things that I'm not convinced actually do keep people safer. So yeah, thoughts on how to bridge? Are you crying?
No, so okay, so this is gonna sound terrible. Okay, so I'm allergic to my dog, and so like I have dog fur on me always, but the second that I wiped my eye with my clothing, I was like, oh fuck. Yeah, so a little bit of an allergic
That is
reaction.
love right there. You got like a fairy-sized love for your dog.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Welcome back, Matt. All right.
She talks shit about my boy, Eric Adams. I'm not getting in the line of fire. Fuck that shit.
You're trying to run for office.
I'm sorry.
Any final thoughts, Tiffany?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think, one, we can't shy away from the fact that we are experiencing a spike in violence. Like, yes, we remain, you know, one of the safest big cities in the country, but, you know, one act of violence is one too many, and so I think it's really important that we acknowledge it and say, like, this is horrific, and that the fear that folks are feeling is real, but like we don't, again, this goes back to this idea of this higher responsibility that as electeds, as people in power, as people who have access to the information that we don't like fold underneath that and say that, look, we hear you, we can hold your pain and your concerns, and that like what we are most, what is most important to us is that we're changing outcomes. And so we could do the same shit that we have done for decades that has not worked for the sake of saying we did something in the moment, or we could do what works, right? Like you look at the increased violence that we've seen in the subway system. Every single time we've seen one of these horrific events, you'll see reporting, and it's like, well, there were 6 cops on the subway platform, you know? And so it's not preventing that, but what could, right? Access, and these are long-term goals, but we need to double and triple down on those investments, right? Access to mental health care, physical barriers so people can't be pushed in the subway, people having a home so that they're not sleeping and vulnerable out in the open at different times, right? Like we know that these things will work, and so we can acknowledge that there's a rise, but then say that like we're going to do the hard work of getting to like what the actual causes are.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.